Hi class, I'm going to walk you through problem C2-35, which is similar to the problem 29 that I walked you through on formation of a corporation and how the rules under 351 apply to transfers of property when you're forming a corp. But in this case, we have one guy, John, who is transferring several different assets to a corporation in exchange for all of the corporation's stock. And so, first of all, we know that this is going to qualify under 351, right? Because he's transferring property, and even if he were transferring some services, that doesn't completely disqualify the transfer under 351. It just means that some of it's going to be taxable. But in this case, all he's transferring is property in exchange for stock. And actually, there will be some taxable portion of this transaction because in addition to stock being received, he's also receiving some notes from the corporation, and that's considered boot. Boot includes cash, and notes and other assets received from the corporation. And as we talked about before, boot received is taxable upon transfer. Now, I cheated a little bit in this because this could end up taking us a while if I had to fill all of this out. So I already completed the problem, and then I figured what I'll do is just walk you through it. So first of all, the facts are that John incorporates his sole proprietorship as All-Star Corporation. So in this case, he's actually incorporating a sole proprietorship. And in exchange for all 100 shares of the All-Star Corporation stock and 4 interest-bearing notes worth $7,500 each. The stock has a $120,000 fair market value, and we know that the notes mature consecutively on the first 4 anniversaries of the incorporation date. That piece of information is not important, so don't worry about that. And then the assets transferred are as follows, and I opened up the asset information. So he transferred cash of $7,500, which of course has a basis and fair market value equal to $7,500. He transferred equipment with a basis of $50,000 and fair market value of $78,000. Building with basis of $50,000 and fair market value of $36,000, and land with a basis of $22,500 and a fair market value of $28,500. So in total, the basis of all property transferred was $130,000, and the fair market value of that property was $150,000. So what we have to do first of all is we have to they have us fill in this table so that we can figure out the realized gain and the recognized gain. And this is what you need to do when you're transferring several assets, because you have to allocate the fair market value. You have to allocate the basis based on the relative allocation of fair market value. So all I did here was I transferred over the fair market value of each piece of property transferred over into the first row, and that totals $150,000. I wish they had a total column here, but they don't. And then I divided the fair market value of each asset by the total fair market value to come up with the percent of the total fair market value. So 7,500 over 150 is 5%, and so on. I'm going to close this down for a minute so I can open this. Next, what we do is we say we have stock in total The stock in total is $120,000 fair market value, and we have to allocate that fair market value of that stock among the property transferred based upon the relative fair market value of each piece of property, which is why we have these first two rows here. So we take 5% of 120,000 and we get 6,000 that we're assigning the fair market value of the stock relative to the cash transferred. And we do that for each of the other properties. So in total, this row here, this stock row, totals 120,000. And we do the same thing with the notes. This row in total for the notes totals 30,000, which is 4 times 7,500. And we allocate the fair market value of the notes to each of the properties transferred relative to those properties' fair market value. And that gives us our total proceeds. So we're just adding 6,000 and 1,500 and so forth across the columns here. So the total proceeds that he receives is the fair market value of the stock of 120 and the 4 notes totaling 30,000. So his total proceeds are 150, and his adjusted basis is, and now we have to open this up again, his adjusted basis in the property transferred is 7,500 for the cash, 50,000 for the equipment, 50,000 for the building, and 22,500 for the land. And what are we trying to do here? We're trying to come up with the realized gain or loss. So, of course, he has no realized gain or loss on the transfer of cash, because cash is cash, and fair market value always equals basis for cash. He has a $28,000 realized gain on the transfer of the equipment, a $14,000 realized loss. So we've got some lost property here, which will make this problem interesting, on the transfer of the building, and a $6,000 realized gain on the transfer of the land. Next, we're just going to list the boot received. So, and we allocate the boot received. We allocate the fair market value of the boot received based upon the relative fair market value that we had calculated above here. So all we're doing with this row is just transferring our amounts that we calculated up here down to here. And the reason we're transferring those amounts down is now what we're going to do is compare the realized gain or loss for each property transferred with the boot received, the amount of boot received, the fair market value of the boot received, and the gain that we recognize is going to be the lesser of the realized gain or the boot received. So in this case, for the transfer of cash, we have a lesser of 0 or 1,500, which is 0. So we have no recognized gain or loss on the transfer of the cash, which that kind of makes sense, right? And then with regard to the transfer of the equipment, we have the lesser of the realized gain of 28 or the boot received of 15,600. So we have a recognized gain on transfer of that equipment of 15,600. And then the building, we have a loss of 14,000 as compared to boot received of 7,200. So the lesser of that is going to be 0. You never recognize any loss on transfer of property on a 351 exchange, but you do sometimes have gain to the transferor. So in this case, we have 0 gain recognized, 0 gain or loss recognized on the transfer of the lost property, the lost building. And then in the case of the land, we have a realized gain of 6,000 as compared to $5,700 of boot received. So we're going to recognize the lesser of those, or 5,700. So our total recognized gain is actually 15,600 plus 5,700, or 21,300. And now we have to calculate John's basis in his stock and notes. So first we're going to calculate the basis in the stock. So remember, the basis in the stock starts out with the basis of the property transferred to the corp. So the basis of all of the property transferred was $130,000, and then we add to that any gain recognized, and that's the $15,600 plus the $5,700, or $21,300, and then we subtract from that the fair market value of the boot received. Those are the rules that we apply to the transferor in calculating his basis in the stock received. And so his basis in the stock received is going to be $121,300. Next, we have to calculate John's basis in the notes, and John's basis in the notes is equal to the fair market value of those, or actually the basis to the corporation, which is $7,500 times 4, which is $30,000. So that's his basis in the notes. Requirement C asks us to determine All-Star's basis in the property received from John. So now we're going to look at the consequences to the transferee corporation. So now what we do is we use our formula that's on page 2-21 of your text for calculating the transferee corporation's basis in the property received from the transferor, John. So we start with the transferor's adjusted basis in the property transferred, and here we just copy down from up above the transferor's adjusted basis, which actually we can get from here. This is the transferor's adjusted basis. So we would copy those amounts here into the first row. Then we add to that any gain recognized by the transferor. So here we just transfer this row, the recognized gain or loss row, which is the $15,600 plus the $5,700. And then we subtract for that the reduction for the lost property. So in this case, we only had one property, the building, which was lost property. And we know that what we need to do is we want to essentially get back down to the fair market value. You'll notice if you actually follow the formula on page 2-21, what it does in the case of just one piece of property that's transferred, it always gets you back to the fair market value of that property. So in this case, if you look at the solution here, and you add across all of these columns, the 7,500, the 65,600, the 48,700, and then 28,200, you sum to 150,000, which is the total fair market value to the transferor of the property transferred. So you might say to yourself, why am I just reducing the building by the 1,300 when in fact my realized loss was 14,000? Well, you're not always going to reduce it by that 14,000 and it discusses this in the book on page 2-21. It essentially says if a corporation's total adjusted basis, including any increase for gain recognized by the shareholder for all properties transferred by the shareholder, exceeds the property's total fair market value, the basis to the corporation of the properties must be reduced by the excess. So what it's telling you to do is it's telling you to look at the sum of these first two rows, the 7,500 plus the 0, the 50,000 plus the 15,600, and so forth, and add up all of that. When you add that up, you will sum to 151,300, and that is in excess of the total fair market value of all properties transferred of 150,000. So then what you do is you allocate that excess among all of the lost property. And in this case, we only have one piece of lost property, which is the building. So the excess $1,300 gets allocated in total to the building, and that's a reduction to the basis of that property in the transferee corporation's hands. And then we end up with a total basis in that lost property of $48,700. So I hope that makes sense to you guys, and good luck in doing your problems. Sorry this was such a long video, 15 plus minutes, but I hope it helps you. And hint, hint, you're probably going to have something similar to this on your midterm. Talk to you soon. Bye.